This is part 2 of the audio lecture on the early Renaissance, and we were talking about humanism. Now, humanism is fascinating because it's really a celebration of the individual, a return to the Greek idea that each person has a unique contribution and that if that is nurtured, the world is a better place. Now, let's contrast this to the idea of in the Middle Ages that really the human individual didn't really matter so much as the great divine, as the afterlife. So this is a real switch. Now, in these schools, they set up a lot of educational opportunities in all of the arts, sciences, math, and these schools developed the body as well as the mind. They encouraged innovation among the student population. They had scholarships for poor students, and they actually educated girls as well as boys. The students learned poetry, grammar, moral philosophy, as well as the arts, music, and the sciences. Now, one of the results of these schools was a sharp rise in literacy, and another was that artists began to have so much more status in society. Instead of being anonymous craftsmen, this, as was true in the Middle Ages, artists were now distinguished members of society. They were honored and treated almost as royalty. Now, most humanists were actually devout Christians, but few saw any conflict between their religion and the study of pagan antiquity. In fact, it was quite fashionable. The city of Florence was known as the New Athens, as it sought to learn from the Golden Age of Greece. This painting above is an anonymous view of the city, but it reflects the humanist ideal. And this painting is based on a sacred geometry, actually. It's all very methodically, carefully plotted. And you can see the linear perspective as the objects move back from us in space. Let's talk more about linear perspective. One of the achievements of the humanist movement was this development. This system creates the illusion of depth on a two-dimensional surface. And that is something that we're all so accustomed to now that it is difficult to imagine that it didn't even exist before the Renaissance. So let's remember, you would want to remember, what is the definition of linear perspective? And that's the system of creating the illusion of depth on a two-dimensional surface, which is what I just said twice. So remember that for a test. Now, this didn't exist before the Renaissance, and Brunelleschi is credited with discovering this system using vanishing points along a horizon line. If you look at the lower right, you can see how it works, and we did talk about it in the lecture on the visual elements. Ultimately, the fact that he did lose the bronze door competition to Ghiberti has been of great benefit to the development of art and architecture, as Brunelleschi made great advances in the fields of art, architecture, and even mathematics. Hey, you know what we're going to talk about next? Nudity. How about it, everybody? It always makes people wake up. Before we go any further, I do want to talk about the nude figure in art, because in art history we tend to just look at nudes without much thought. And that's because they've always existed in the world of art. And any study of the history of art will have to include painting of the undraped figure, because this has been part of artistic expression way back to the days of cave painting. Now, what's interesting to notice is to see what is acceptable in various societies and what is not. To the left are two very similar images. The one at the top was done by the artist Manet in the year 1863. And the one is an etching done after a painting, and this etching is done by the artist Raphael. At the time of the Manet painting, the one above, it was shown it was so scandalous. Now I want you to notice the differences between these two paintings, because first off, the one below would be considered much more risque. It was done much earlier, but it didn't really cause a stir at all. But the one at the top of the page, oh my gosh, women and children were not allowed to see it. It was covered with a drape, only people who could handle it could see it. Why? Because the painting at the bottom represents a scene from mythology. That's the ticket. If it's not present time, but it's from a mythical past, man, anything goes. But the painting above, first off, the models were recognizable. They were not sort of anonymous women. They were people you might see on the street. And the guys, well, they're clothed. And most importantly, it's done in contemporary clothes at the time. So that was considered to be totally risque. Now let's fast forward to American culture. Now, for some reason, the female nude is completely acceptable. Well, relatively speaking. I mean, it's much more widely seen than the male nude. And it's just a matter of societal preference. Because when you look at the Greeks, oh my gosh, you never saw female nudity, but males, no big thing. So really what I'm trying to say is that depiction of the nude figure throughout is prevalent throughout art, and really the most interesting thing to see about it is what's socially acceptable and what is not, and that shifts dramatically from era to era throughout history. Here's Donatello, and he's considered one of the most innovative artists of the Renaissance. He seemed to approach each commission with the question, how can I do this better? Now his version of David to the left is the first bronze of a male nude since antiquity, since the Greek times, Greek and Roman times. The attitude of the figure seems to suggest almost the fragility of a child, even as he's got the head of a giant at his feet. Now, by the way, the hat is kind of foppish, but it's really a peasant hat of the day. Now, I want to really talk about this Penitent Magdalene on the right because it's very innovative. It is the first freestanding wooden sculpture that has survived. So if any of you have done any woodworking, you know that wood breathes. It cracks, it shifts with environmental influences. So what Donatello did was he hollowed out this figure all the way up, under her skirt, all the way up the interior of the figure, so that it could breathe. Up before this time, wooden sculptures would be attached to like a big wooden thing, like she would be leaning on a big tree trunk or something to keep her stable. But instead, he hollowed her out, and this sculpture is still surviving intact to this day. Now, the story is that Mary Magdalene has been in the wilderness for 40 years, existing only on air and prayer, so to speak. She's clothed only in her long, ragged hair as she comes back from the wilderness nearing the end of her life. Beautiful piece, and very unlike what we've seen before. So this is Jan van Eyck, and what you need to know about this dude is that he is the first artist to make wide use of oil paints. So who is the first artist to widely use oil, to really revolutionize oil painting? Jan van Eyck. Make a note of it. They'd been around for some time, but he was the guy who really started mixing pigments with linseed oil and doing this instead of fresco. This particular painting has all sorts of symbolism and is actually supposed to be a marriage document. Like he signed it right there, and artists didn't usually, they were just starting to sign their work really. There's a candelabra with only one candle lit. There's all sorts of symbols throughout this painting, which has made it a very mysterious and an important painting. Now let's talk about Botticelli, who painted in egg tempera. And he's one of my favorites. I have a lot of favorites, but he's right up there. This is The Birth of Venus, painted by him in the year 1484. And it's based on a pagan tale of Venus coming out of the sea. It's actually probably one of the most famous paintings of all time. One of the, say, top 5 I want you to remember after this class. So in this painting, Venus is innocent and is just coming, she's just being born, blown by the wind god Zephyr and welcomed by a woman who's going to cover her with a flowered shawl. Unlike the layers of oil paint, this artist uses egg tempera, where he's using egg yolks mixed with pigment. And I'm sorry, I said fresco, but he's really using egg tempera for this. And egg tempera is a fascinating media, because egg yolks are mixed with pigment and it's painted on the surface. With egg tempera, you have to make very small strokes because it dries immediately. And it's amazing to think that egg would last this long, but it really does. Sandro Botticelli was a really prolific and respected painter. He was known for practical jokes and for being just a jovial, good guy. Now, in his later life, he had a spiritual crisis and he stopped painting. He died almost penniless, but he was supported by the goodwill of his admirers, younger artists who had been inspired by him and uh, his past patrons. This spiritual crisis that was brought on by the message of a fanatical monk named Savonarola. And this guy preached passionately against the worldliness of the people of Florence. He gathered their worldly goods like their fancy dresses and their paintings, and he burned them in these huge bonfires. So Savonarola's work was the original meaning of the term bonfire of the vanities, and Botticelli burned many of his own paintings during this time. Here's two versions of St. Augustine in his study by the great artist Botticelli. Here's one that I love, Madonna of the Pomegranate. And notice the hint of sadness on the face of Mary, on the angels, even on the Christ child. They say, it's as if they can sense the end of the story. One interesting thing is that Botticelli really used this one female model for all of his work. And she was a woman, a noble woman, who died at the age of 34, and he's said to have been in love with her. This is the artist Andrea Mantegna, and he was one of the most influential Renaissance painters who actually lived and worked outside of Florence. He worked in the city of Padua. He was greatly influenced by Donatello, and he entered the Painters Guild at the age of 15. He was really a master of foreshortening, which is what we talked about earlier, when the figure seems to come towards you. And the rules of perspective are used to accomplish this. And looking at this foreshortened Christ, which you would want to be able to identify, notice how the feet are really smaller than you would think they would actually be. They'd be little pin feet if Jesus just got up. But he did that as a creative device in order to make the painting work overall. It's a very powerful work. Let's look at more of his foreshortening. I just love this one on the left. I mean, where else do you get to see little cherubs? And cherubs from the back. Here's a peacock. Here's a flower pot that we could all relate to from today. This is painted on a ceiling because Mantegna worked in a palace in Padua, and he worked there for over 12 years. He kept working on this ceiling, and I just find this a great example of foreshortening. Oh, we have a couple of more artists to talk about. First off, something completely different, which is the artist Harmonius Bosch. Now, he had a taste for the bizarre. Here are two of his representations of the end of the life of Christ. Now, think of Bosch as being a little bit risque, a little racy, and a little cartoonish. His work was widely collected, but the great patrons would kind of put it in the back room. They would not show it to everyone because some of his work was kind of hard to watch. But what I want you to notice on both of these images is how the Christ figure looks very serene and the people around him look very kind of ghoulish. Now we're going to finish this slideshow to sum it all up with two pieces that are just both interesting and beautiful. To the left is one by the artist Piero della Francesca, which we've already looked at. And this depicts the dream in which the Emperor Constantine was inspired to end the persecution of the Christians. And he went into battle with the cross at the forefront, won the battle, and that was it. The persecution of the Christians was done. And above is a bust by the artist Santiano. And it's just a beautiful bust of a boy, but it looks so Greek in its depiction. The Renaissance produced such a wealth of interesting art and stories that we're really only able to scratch the surface here. But with the next module, we will scratch a bit deeper as we'll go up into the High Renaissance. So stay tuned. Enjoy looking at this great wealth of art, and more next week. Thanks for listening.